Let's go now to the Shadow Defence Minister, Deputy Labor Leader Richard Marles. Thanks so much for your time. The state dinner and this official visit, it reflects, I guess, the depth, the strength of the bilateral relationship right now under Prime Minister Morrison. Do you agree with that?
Well, it certainly is a very strong relationship, and we often talk about the fact that irrespective of who the President is and who is the Prime Minister, the alliance endures, and it certainly does, and it's as relevant today as it's ever been. But it also does matter that there is a good personal rapport between the two leaders, and the state dinner that's being put on for the Prime Minister, I think, does reflect that.
Australia escaped tariffs in the first round of the trade move by President Trump. Again, not picked up by many, but again on uranium exports over the weekend, Australia was exempt from any tariffs on those. Quite significant again. It seems Australia is being treated differently, not just to other nations, but other allies as well, and treated more positively. Would you agree with that?
I think we have done well in terms of the way in which we've managed the alliance relationship during the Trump administration, and there are decisions such as those that you've referred to where we have done well. It's not something that we can obviously take for granted going forward, and it remains really important that we continue to advocate for Australia's interest within the context of the alliance, and I do think that is occurring. But look, fundamentally, this is a very stable relationship. It has been for many decades now, and it is that irrespective of who is in government, either in Washington or in Canberra. But it is a significant honour that the state dinner is being put forward, as you reported at the top of the show, and that obviously is a good thing for the country.
You joined the Prime Minister on Friday visiting the USS Ronald Reagan, which that vessel here, part of the Talisman Sabre exercises. The power is on show, as it is every year with that exercise. But do you think that the President still has the same commitment to have a presence in our region as his predecessors?
It is an important question, and certainly the focus of Australian foreign policy needs to be about engaging America on terms such that we encourage them to be as present as possible in East Asia for as long as possible. The East Asian time zone and, of course, in and around Australia. But I do think that is occurring. If you look at the military presence, for example, or the military footprint of the United States in the East Asian time zone during the first term of this Trump administration, it will actually grow rather than shrink. And the fact that the Americans have been willing to send an aircraft carrier to participate in exercise Talisman Sabre, I think is a really big statement about both the importance they place on these exercises, which are very significant for our defence forces as well, but it's a big statement about how significantly they regard the alliance.
Before the G20, the President was threatening to, criticising and many seeing as a threat to end the security agreement with Japan, saying it's one-sided, that the Japanese aren't required to defend America if they come under threat like the US is with Japan. Does that show, though, that he is unpredictable when it comes to what has been, well, in that case, an agreement since 1960, and I guess can be seen in the context of other allies as well?
Well, I think this is a president who would wear unpredictability as a badge of honour, to be honest. So I think he would be happy that you're describing him in those terms, and it's how he goes about his business as the president, and it's just something we have to come to terms with, and it's really how he's gone about his business throughout his life. Having said all of that, of course, it really matters to Australia that America maintains its alliance relationship with Japan and other allies within the East Asian time zone. Like that alliance structure, those network of alliances are really critical for Australia, and it goes to America's presence in this region. For example, the USS Ronald Reagan that we visited on Friday is an aircraft carrier whose home port is in Japan. Its ability to participate in an exercise such as Talisman Sabre, but to operate in waters in and around Australia is enhanced or enabled by virtue of the fact that it is able to be based in Japan. So that is a very critical relationship for Australia's interest, and it is where it's critical that we continue to advocate our interests to the United States within the context of the alliance.
Yeah, and you said the President wears that unpredictability as a badge of honour. I guess it's relevant. The reason I'm asking you about this is because, say, for example, with Iran, there becomes pressure on Australia to act in support of the United States in that region in the Gulf. Is there added pressure on our government to say yes to any request because of the unpredictability of the President, the fact that he could turn on Australia like he has other allies?
Well, again, I think we need to react to what is done rather than what is said. And your points in the beginning of this interview are true, that the relationship that he has had with Australia during this term of the American administration has been very positive, and we should act on that basis and reciprocate in relation to that. In terms of any requests about further Australian engagement based on what is currently going on in relation to Iran, I mean, that would need to be considered very carefully, but I'm unaware of any requests coming through yet. Of course, we've had briefings from the government and we'll continue to seek briefings from the government about the state of their conversations with the United States. But requests of that kind would need to be considered very carefully. But I suppose the ultimate point here is, I think with a president such as President Trump, it does require us to constantly be mindful and about what our interests are and be ready to advocate for them within the context of the alliance, and that is going to be really important. We've had an instinct of supporting the US, and that's, of course, from where I sit, very appropriate, but it's on top of that instinct, it's really important that we are constantly asking ourselves what's an appropriate step for Australia to take and be ready to make those arguments within the context of the alliance.
Is there a risk the government, though, would feel added pressure to contribute to military action on something like that, given the President's temperament?
Well, at the end of the day, it's not about the President's temperament, and it shouldn't be about whatever pressures the government feels from others. It should be about the government engaging in an analysis of what is Australia's national interest and acting accordingly and being ready to explain that to the Australian people. And that's what we would be expecting of the government, and that's what they need to do, not only in relation to any request that may or may not come in respect of that issue, but in relation to the way in which they conduct foreign policy in general.
You say it's not about his temperament, but one of a senior figure in the government put it to me in Osaka that at the G20 that this president's the most powerful in recent history because it all comes from his gut. Decisions are made by gut, and it's all him basically. What do you say in response to that?
I don't know. I don't know the president, so I can't answer as to how he makes his decisions. I would agree with the observation that I think that President Trump is, in the context of how things are operating in DC, a very powerful president. I think the decisions are emanating from the White House, and of course the American system is a very large system, and so you will get differing views from the State Department or the Pentagon from time to time as compared to the White House. I think this is a president who is very much in charge of the way in which decisions are being made in DC. I agree with that observation, but ultimately all we can do as a nation is react to how America makes its decisions, but that we then making our own decisions in the context of the alliance and in the context of how we navigate foreign policy based on Australia's interest. And it's really important that we are doing that on the basis of constantly thinking about what our national interest is, and that instinct alone is not the basis upon which decisions are made.
Watching the Talisman Sabre exercise has been a Chinese spy ship. Is that a concern to you?
Not really. There was a Chinese ship that was at Talisman Sabre in 2017. Look, Talisman Sabre is a really important event. I don't know the extent to which viewers will understand it, but short of going into an operational theatre, for the thousands of men and women in our Defence Forces, Talisman Sabre is really the biggest moment every 2 years, and there will be months of work that has gone into their participation in this exercise. So it's a really important moment for us, and one of the things that we picked up in visiting the USS Ronald Reagan on Friday is it's clearly a very significant exercise for the Americans as well. I don't think those participating in the exercise are going to be particularly fazed by the presence of a Chinese vessel. At one level, it is to be expected. Ultimately, what matters for Australia is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We exercise our rights under that treaty all around the world and in places like the South China Sea. So we can't really complain that other countries like China are exercising their rights under that convention in waters closer to Australia, and ultimately China's not doing anything other than abiding by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So at the end of the day, I think it's important that we don't overreact to this, and I don't actually think that people will be particularly fazed by it in terms of what they're going to be doing over the next month.
So do you think then there's a double standard from China when they've been critical of others exercising their freedom of navigation rights in the South China Sea?
Oh, look, the way I would put it, Kieran, is that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is what matters to Australia's national interest, and we rely on it to exercise our rights of freedom of navigation all around the world, but in places like the South China Sea. And if that's the position that we hold, then we can't really complain if there are countries which are exercising their rights under the same convention in waters closer to Australia. And I think that's the posture that we need to take about what's going on with a Chinese vessel watching Talisman Sabre. And as I say, this is not something new. It's what happened 2 years ago. Those participating in the exercises from the Australian Defence Force and the American Armed Forces will be well and truly prepared for that eventuality. It's not going to have a big impact on the way in which they engage in these exercises, and so I don't think we should overreact to it, and instead I think we should just be all wishing all of those who are participating in the exercises our very best.
Do you see any link between this presence of the Chinese spy ship and that visit to Sydney recently by the Chinese warships? Are they stepping up their activity around Australia and the region?
I don't see any link between those two. In a more general sense, I think what you're seeing is China's growth and China being more assertive around the world, actually, and that's what a great power does. So I don't say that with any judgment around China. I think it's just the way in which China is, the trajectory that China is on, but it does shape Australia's strategic circumstances, and we need to be thinking about the world in that context. And it does raise some significant challenges for us in the way in which we go about the way we navigate strategic policy and foreign policy, and it requires a lot of thought. And I do think that we are facing as challenging a set of strategic circumstances today as we have probably at any time since the Second World War. And it's very important, therefore, that we are very thoughtful about the way in which we go about this, and that as a nation, we step up the leadership side of our international personality.
And in that, do you want to see greater leadership in our region with like-minded nations, Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, all of which face a similar dilemma in that their biggest trading partners are China? Well, certainly in Japan's case, their biggest security ally is the United States. It's a similar setup, although they are right alongside China and have geographical tensions with China over one particular island chain.
I think that's an important observation, because there are a lot of countries in the East Asian time zone with whom we've had long and deep relationships who have similar sets of circumstances, similar sets of strategic circumstances to our own. And so it is important that we are working closely with them and comparing notes. It's also important to just take a moment and acknowledge that the rise of China has been a fundamentally good thing for Australia. Our economy has benefited enormously by it. So it's not to say that it is something to be feared, but it is something that we need to come to terms with. Where I get to in my thinking is that that international leadership side of our international personality is something that we need to be better at. And it is in our places in our immediate region, like the Pacific, where I think for a long time we've been present, but not with really any significant intent. And we need to play a better role there, but first and foremost for the countries of the Pacific who look to us for leadership in what is for them a very challenging part of the world, where this is the 10 million people in the world who perform worst against the Millennium Development Goals. Working with those countries in partnership to promote their prosperity and their security is something that we should be doing much more about, and that does then have Australia play a bigger role in global affairs, and I think ultimately that's the way in which we need to move forward in terms of these challenging strategic times.
A couple of issues relating to domestic politics to conclude. One is this announcement today via the newspapers of the government's change to the deeming rate, which affects hundreds of thousands of those on the pension. Is this a sufficient response from the government in your view? No,
it's not. I think pensioners today will feel shortchanged. I mean, we've seen, Kieran, 5 reductions in the cash rate since the deeming rate was last changed 4 years ago, back in 2015. So in that period of time, the cash rate has gone down by 1.25%. This is the first movement that we've seen in the deeming rate since then, and it is only 0.25%. This is far too little, far too late. And the truth is that what this really means is that the government continues to have its hands in the pockets of pensioners. And at the same time, I think pensioners today can feel like this decision is a slap in their face. I mean, this is a government which is attempting to balance its books on the back of pensioners, and it's simply not good enough. And there'll be a whole lot of pensioners out there who are doing it really tough at the moment. We've seen a lot of increases in costs of many things. People are making difficult decisions which involve missing out and going without. And for some people, this represents more than $1,000 a year in this decision. And this is simply not enough, and it is not good enough.
But official rates aren't always indicative, are they, of how much retirees can earn? For example, share dividends can earn 4%.
But an expectation for people on the pension at that point in their life to be engaging in that kind of risk around their investments is completely unfair and unrealistic. I mean, what we have seen in the last 4 years is the gap between the cash rate and the deeming rate double. It has doubled under this government's watch. And the decision today is far too little, far too late. And I think pensioners today will feel extremely shortchanged by what this government has done.
One final question on Indigenous recognition. Are you optimistic there might be some compromise here? Because immediately after the Minister Ken Wyatt's speech, there were criticisms from within the Liberal Party and outside of it about some of the elements of his vision on this issue. What's your sense of things right now, given the Prime Minister has called for bipartisanship in this space?
Well, I would love for there to be a sense of optimism about this. Labor's position has been very clear. We want to see Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. And when we all listened to Minister Wyatt's speech, that appeared to us as though we were moving down a path where we might be able to get bipartisanship with the government. But literally within hours of that speech being made, you saw all the divisions arise within the government on this issue. You almost saw a captain's recall from Prime Minister Morrison in respect of what Minister Wyatt had said. I mean, I think Minister Wyatt would have every reason to be outraged by the way in which he was treated by his own Prime Minister in the aftermath of the speech that he made. And so before we get to a question of bipartisanship between Labor and Liberal on this question, we actually need to see the government work out its own internals and come to a position itself. And much and all as I would love to have optimism about this, the fact of the government's own internal divisions doesn't deliver a lot of that optimism for me.
Richard Marles, thanks for your time this Sunday.
Thanks, Kieran.